Welcome to another edition of the 1% Better podcast with your host, Rob O'Donoghue.
Hello there. Welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. And it is another Me, mySELF and EI part this week of that series on emotional intelligence. We're calling it part 7. But it is also part of 1% Better. And I'm probably confusing everybody at this stage. But it is a very, very good episode, this one, focusing deeper again on self-awareness. So last Friday, I released the first 6 episodes of Me, mySELF and EI. All in one fell swoop, all came down around midnight or thereabouts on the Friday morning. And I said I'd give that a lash, something I've never done before. I think I've released 2 or maybe 4 before, but never 6. Definitely takes a lot of work in the background, putting it together, getting it ready to go out. It's nice then, though, when you put all 6 out, knowing that they're out there and it'll take a while for people to check them all out or some of them out. And it's just great to have extra content out there that you can check out for free and dip in and dip out of. And there is a pattern, I suppose, a story that will continue on through this series as it works the whole way through the emotional intelligence umbrella or framework or model or whatever term you want to use. I don't know what the right term is, but it is touching on so many competencies. And I said we'd start with self-awareness because that and awareness in general is the foundation and build from there. So thanks for checking it out. What I would love if you did take a few minutes of your time after listening is to drop me an email, rob@robofthegreen.ie, to give me some genuine feedback. Is there anything that stood out more for you than others in those first 6 episodes? Any parts you didn't like? Because there's a mix of pure solo and interview. Let me know, because that, again, is the only way I can improve, by hearing from others. As much as I think I know what's going on myself and how it could go down, the ultimate is feedback, uncovering blind spots that I might have, and I'm sure I do have, and I always will have. And that's interesting because that's part of what we talk about today. You might have noticed in this title, the Dinner of Truth, and that's all about learning what you don't know about yourself and asking for feedback. So I've laboured on that point now, but please do give me some feedback and ideas as we progress with this series. Next week, I'll probably be back releasing a very typical, traditional 1% Better interview, and have a few of those lined up, but we'll dip in and out of Me, mySELF and EI over the next while as well. And this one is a brilliant episode. Honestly, one of the most enjoyable interviews I've done of all the shows. And as I went through the notes, I took so much from it in the editing process and writing down takeaways, and I've obviously shared most of that in the notes with this episode, but it was brilliant. And the reason it's so good is because the lady that I interviewed, Tasha Eurich, Ph.D. in Organisational Psychology, a researcher and a New York Times bestseller. She's 2 amazing books out called Bankable Leadership and Insights. And her TED Talk has been viewed, she's done 2 TED Talks, but one, the more recent one that ties into self-awareness and insights, has been multiple tens of millions of times viewed. And I really enjoyed watching it in the preparation for this. It was a real honour to have her on the show. She is high profile. She knows what she's talking about. She's done the research. It's not just reading from a book and regurgitating it out again. She's very big into empirical data and interviews. It can certainly come across that she knows what she is talking about. The interview, again, is all about self-awareness and looking at it from an internal perspective and an external. I was putting together a paper a while back on awareness and why leaders should become their own chief awareness officers. I used some of Tasha's material in putting that together. And the truth of her research is that 95% of us think we are very self-aware, but in actual fact, it's only about 10 or 15% that actually are. And that was very insightful and something I wanted to know more about. And we talked about that in the interview. As I said earlier, it's packed with insights. The book is called Insights, but it's packed with them that Tasha discovered from her own career journey. From a very young age, she knew what she wanted to do in her grown-up years, and she's definitely living that. But it's loaded with, from the research she's done, lots from her own books and from her own consulting and executive coaching practice that she's been running for the last decade. Ties it all in together in the form of books, but also in the form of podcasts and output that she shares. There's tools in here that you can use to develop your internal self-awareness, asking yourself questions on how could you improve and what did you do today that went well and what could go better, and also looking for feedback, and that's more external self-awareness that I talked about, the dinner of truth that you might take up and have a virtual dinner with somebody in the near future. Definitely useful, lots of 1% better tips that will tie in with the self-development, self-awareness, and obviously emotional intelligence as well. Lots more about Tasha in the show notes at the end. You can subscribe to her website. She has a quiz in there around self-awareness that you might use. So I'll leave it there. As always, please do subscribe to the podcast. We're 1% better, and this one, Me, Myself and EI Live, or email me rob@robofthegreen.ie and give me some information that you have to share that could make the whole thing improve a little bit more. So let's give it over to Tasha Eurich and this one on self-awareness. Enjoy and be safe. Good luck. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the podcast. This episode is going to probably definitely focus on helping you become more self-aware, more than 1%, I would hope. And I'm really, really genuinely delighted to introduce my guest for this one, Tasha Eurich. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you, and really excited about talking to you about your own journey, but also the work you do and what are the areas to focus in on around self-awareness and how we can help listeners improve in one way or another. What I'll start with is my own interest in people's background and the work they do. And I often like to ask people, what's their earliest memory? What's your earliest memory?
Oh, gosh. Well, it factors into my origin story pretty beautifully. It was being probably 5 or 6 years old and being with my mother at the company that she founded, and literally following her around and watching how much of an impact a business could make on the people that work in it, and how much impact leaders can make for the people that they work with. And that really cemented, I think, just a lifelong passion for helping leaders create successful businesses that positively impact people's lives.
Wow. And at the age of 6, you kind of knew that.
I did. I've always been a bit of an old soul, but a single mom didn't have a lot, to do with me. So sometimes I would come with her to work, and in some ways it was my earliest leadership education.
Okay, no, my mom was a single mom as well, and I'm not sure, probably not a similar kind of career. She was entrepreneurial, so it kind of gave me a drive to be independent in lots of ways, I suppose, as well. It's interesting because I've interviewed a lot of people and they've mentioned they had single moms and have gone on to do really good things. Just to follow on to that then, from that early age, it sounds like you had a good sense of what you were going to be when you grew up. Did you feel that it was the work you were meant to do? Do you believe in that sort of like vocation almost?
I do. I can think of actually the moment in my life when my life's purpose was abundantly clear to me. I was at university, I was studying theater and psychology. And, I'm a lifelong theater nerd from a self-awareness standpoint. I knew I probably wasn't good enough to do it professionally. So was shopping for other careers, and I found psychology. And I loved the study of human behavior, but I also really didn't see myself as a therapist. There was something about it that just didn't fit for me. I did a bunch of internships early on in college in kind of mental health care settings, and just didn't really float my boat. But I decided in my junior year of college that I wanted to find, I decided, in my youthful ignorance, I was like, I wonder if someone's ever thought of business psychology. Maybe someone could invent the intersection of organizations and psychology. And as it turns out, that had been around for a very long time, since essentially World War II. And I went to a tiny little liberal arts college in the United States, and I didn't have any ability to take courses in organizational psychology. So I moved to New York in the summer of 2001, and I took a very small summer school course of something called industrial organizational psychology. And I remember it was taught by this very bored Italian TA. She didn't want to be there. She wanted to take the summer off and be with her friends. Grad school is really hard. And I just remember sitting there in that first lecture, and it was almost like heavens opened up and said, this is what you were put on this earth to do. And I was really lucky to have had that experience early on in my life, because from there, I didn't look back. I immediately applied to Ph.D. programs. I picked my favorite one. I studied for 5 years. I went into the private sector, and then I started my own consulting practice a little more than 10 years ago.
Very, very interesting. I interviewed Barry Schwartz on the podcast a few months ago. Have you heard of Barry Schwartz? The Paradox of Choice was the big book he released.
Yes, absolutely. Great work.
Great guy and really interesting. And something stuck with me when I talked to him about our journeys and how hard work gets you. He believes luck has a huge role to play in everybody's success. Is that something you would believe?
I do. I also, one thing I would add to that, hard work, luck, and paying attention. And I think that's a good way to frame our discussion today on self-awareness. I, by no means do I have everything figured out, but I do think as I look back on my life, that was one area where I was paying attention to sort of the reservations I was having. It's a pretty traditional career path for a person majoring in psychology would be to go into counseling or therapy. And I allowed myself to not take that path, I think, because I was paying really close attention.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and it just struck me when I talked to Barry, and I like asking people how they think luck has a role to play. So you mentioned we were going to talk very much about self-awareness. Just before we do and talk about insight and the learnings from that, your first book, Bankable Leadership, can you talk to me a little bit about that and maybe what you learned from putting that book together that fed into insight?
Sure. So, wow, that's a blast from the past. I published it in 2013, and that was actually right a couple years after I had gone out on my own, and was really trying to codify what I had learned about leadership in the first 10 or so years of my career. And what I kept coming back to, whether I was working with a nurse in a frontline leadership role in a hospital, or I was working with the CEO of a large Fortune 500 company, I saw this tension that almost every leader faced on virtually a daily basis between making their people happy and driving results, and results can be sort of a broad, swath depending on the type of organization you're in. If it's a for-profit organization, it's, hitting your numbers. If it's a not-for-profit organization, it's a sustainable organization, continuing to survive and serve your mission. And what I was really intrigued by that idea of, it's not this sort of either or thing. And as I got into it, I learned that most leaders had a preference between people and results. And this is sort of a grossly oversimplified way of looking at it. But on one hand, you have what I call the cool parent leader, who's somebody who, I just want to be your friend. I don't think of me as a boss. Steve Carell from The Office, or, Ricky Gervais from The Office, depending on which version of The Office you watch, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is metaphorically the trail of dead bodies leader, right? So the first one is focused sort of exclusively on people. The other side is exclusively on results. Most people aren't that extreme, but there's somewhere in between. And what I discovered in my empirical research and doing, dozens and dozens of interviews with successful leaders is that the best leaders were able to balance both. And as it relates to your second part of your question, how it influenced my most recent book, Insight, there was in the conclusion of Bankable Leadership, I just kind of like offhandedly said, hey, there's 3 steps to becoming a more bankable leader. 1 is knowing yourself. 2 is practicing, or 2 is picking one thing, and then 3 is practicing every day. And I ended up doing a TED Talk, my first of 2 TED Talks, on sort of that 3-step formula. And when I did it, the outpouring that we got from people that really connected with that first step in the equation was incredible. And that was actually what started to lead me to think about, okay, what is this foundational skill of self-awareness? What is it really? Why is it so important? And then how can I help people get more of it?
Brilliant. Really interesting to hear that. And to bring it into the self-awareness, what fascinates me a little bit about it, and you mentioned knowing thyself, I think about 5 or 6 years ago was when I began to properly know myself in my mid-30s. Got there in the end. I suppose that's not a bad thing, but self-awareness has been around forever, I guess, but it's really in the last number of years, short few years, that it seems to have come to the fore more, and maybe that's just for me, it's become more into my own line of sight. But would you say that's the truth, and why do you think it's become so important recent times?
Oh gosh. Oh, there's so many parts to that question. That
I won't have to speak for the rest of the podcast. I can.
I know. I could just drone on about that for 2 hours. But let me try to be succinct. Okay. So I think the first part of your question is absolutely true. That in some ways, self-awareness is a concept as old as humans. You go back all the way to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where the Greeks inscribed "Know thyself." And so I think it's been up until, the past 50 or 60 years, it's really been the exclusive purview of almost philosophy, right? Of just this idea of like, what does it take to know yourself? But what I found really interesting, and I'm a science nerd at heart, was when I started to look at the actual scientific research that had been done on the subject, it really only started in sort of the last half of the 1900s. And in addition to that, the research that was being done was very fragmented. It wasn't unified. It was sort of scattered across a lot of different disciplines. And we didn't really know a whole lot. But then what happened, call it, I'd say like 8 years ago. That's just a sort of a random number that feels right to me, although I probably could be more scientific about it. Business leaders started to eclipse what we knew about sort of the science of self-awareness because they were seeing how critically important it was. And if you think about, what's been going on in business and, especially the last month, is that the pace of change or the rate of change is accelerating to such an extent that leaders can no longer rely on the things that got them where they are today, right? That we've all experienced this, you wake up and all of the rules are different. And so for me, when I look at why self-awareness has become so important, and why, frankly, the science needed to catch up and catch up quickly, is that it's the meta skill of the 21st century. We can only be as effective of a leader as we are self-aware, as an effective of a communicator, an influencer, a disruptor, right? And so I think that's why I felt so much passion about not just preaching about self-awareness, but studying it. And our research team, this is now, 6 or 7 years ago, began a very large scale scientific research program on the science of self-awareness. So what is it? Where does it come from? Why do we need it? How do we increase it? And what was really interesting was there were quite a few surprises along the way. And that's really what I see my contribution to this conversation about self-awareness is let's bring the actual science into it and see what it tells us.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating approach. And as I was doing my research about you, the word research did come up a lot, and you've just kind of confirmed that your science nerd behind it all helps back that up. So maybe talk to me about the approach of the research, and as you've started to dive into that, some of the things that started to emerge that were really strong and that really helped drive the content of the book.
Oh gosh, there's so many things. Let me start maybe with what I think was our most surprising finding.
Yeah.
So this was very early on in the study, and what I decided I wanted to do was, survey about 300 people. And I had this hypothesis that, of course, the people who spent the most time introspecting, really deeply considering their thoughts and feelings and motives, that the more time they spent doing that, the better off they would be. So that they would be more self-aware, that they would be happier, more in control. They'd be less depressed, less anxious. And so I ran the study, and I remember I was sitting up in my office, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I was eating smart food popcorn, and I did the pretty simple analysis, and it actually showed the exact opposite of what I thought I would find. So not only did people who spent a lot of time introspecting show a lot of kind of negative outcomes, they were more stressed, more anxious, less in control of their lives, less happy with their relationships. They actually, wait for this, were less self-aware. And I sort of had this moment of like, oh my God, what have I just stumbled on? First I said, did I do my analyses wrong? Did I code this wrong? And no, I did it 3 or 4 times. And that was actually what the data were telling us. And so we came to this really interesting point in the study where I was honestly asking the question, is self-awareness actually good? Is it adaptive? Or should I be writing a book about blissful ignorance and delusion and encouraging people to do that?
Yeah.
And as it turns out, it took us a little while to dig into this and find other studies and sort of replicate what we were finding. But what we discovered is it's not that introspection in and of itself doesn't work to become more self-aware. It's just the way that most people do it is incorrect. And that's a theme that runs through a lot of what we've learned in our study and others as well, is that, despite our best efforts and despite our level of confidence that we're self-aware, most of us have a lot more room to improve than we think. So the sort of stunning statistic that I often quote is we found that about 95% of people believe that they are self-aware, but only about 10 to 15% of us actually are. And, the joke I always make about that is that it means that on a good day, 80% of us are lying to ourselves about whether we're lying to ourselves. Now, does that mean that we're bad people? No. Does it mean that we can never become more self-aware? Absolutely not. It's actually, I think, one of the most learnable skills out there. But what I think is important for each and every one of us to start doing, given all this, is to question the paths that we've been using to get there. And then even more fundamentally to say, wait a minute, if I wasn't as self-aware as I thought, how would I know?
So that's really interesting, Tasha. What I was taking from that was, as you were explaining it, the 10 or 15% of people that actually are, and the flip side, the 80 or so that aren't, they're obviously reflecting, they're obviously thinking that they're being self-aware, but are they just thinking? Is that the problem? And the second part is, when we maybe shine a light on that, how do they then start actually practicing self-awareness?
One of the most interesting parts about our study was we found 50 people, 50, who didn't start out as self-aware, but throughout the course of their adult lives, they dramatically improved their level of self-knowledge, both sort of knowing who they were internally and then understanding how other people saw them. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating. We did these exhaustive interviews with them and really tried to get in their brains and figure out how, what are they doing that's different than the average person, who is not particularly self-aware. And the first thing we found was almost this paradox. Paradox was, these are arguably some of the most self-aware people, you could come across. They did feel confident about their self-knowledge, but at the same time, they had this sense that there was always more they could learn. So it was sort of this inherent self-compassionate curiosity. One of our subjects was a middle school science teacher, and he gave a great analogy of the process of becoming, self-aware throughout your life. It's like exploring space. He said, no matter what it is we know about ourselves, there's always more to know. And in fact, what we don't know probably eclipses what we do know. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important lesson for all of us is, I named it the braver but wiser mindset. So it's assumption that, it's always better to know than to not know. What's really scary is not having that clarity about who we are and how we're seen. And then 2 is that, to never get too confident in our level of self-knowledge. So many of our participants told us stories about, I had a conversation with my significant other, and they told me that our marriage was not, in fact, going as well as I thought it was. And wow, that was a surprise. And so I had to recalibrate. And I think if we all have those moments in our lives, if we're open to recalibrating, if we have that mindset, that sets us up for a much greater chance of actually increasing our self-awareness. And then the other thing I'd say, and we can talk about specific tools because that's something that obviously is very important. But the other thing that I encourage people to think about is don't put pressure on yourself to go from 0 to 60 overnight. We found that there were lots of different types of events that increase people's self-awareness. There's some of the classic ones where, I called it an earthquake event, where it's something so big and so profound that you almost can't help but learn about yourself. So that would be, going back to my example, your spouse serves you divorce papers, or you don't get a promotion that you thought you were absolutely going to get at work, these kind of big things. But we also found that the vast majority of the events that helped people improve their self-awareness were what I named everyday insights. And this is basically small, incremental, daily insights that if you add them up over the course of time, have the potential to give us extraordinary improvements in how we see ourselves and the clarity. So I think if we, some people just wait for like the lightning bulb mixed metaphor, the lightning bolt or the light bulb.
Yeah.
And, sometimes we're waiting forever and those things don't happen. But if we're engineering, if you think about like 1%, what if you could get 1% more self-aware every week and parse that over the course of years? And that's when you can really make a huge improvement. So I think those mindsets and practices are a really good starting point.
Mm-hmm. Perfect alignment with the name of this podcast in 1%
Yes.
Better. What was interesting for me when you talk about that 50 selection or that sample of 50 people that were the ones that maybe were the most self-aware, was there anything in their background that was kind of influencing that, or was there anything they were doing by chance that was helping them become more self-aware?
This is what is really cool, I think. We did not find any patterns based on demographics. So there was no patterns about age or gender or national origin or industry or job type or level. These were people who were, I mentioned our teacher. So we had a Fortune 50 CEO, we had stay-at-home parents, we had artists, entrepreneurs. And it was fascinating because these people had to clear basically 4 hurdles empirically, and they were pretty rigorous. Number one was they had to score very, very high in our 70-item scientifically validated self-assessment of self-awareness. So they had to say, yes, I have clarity on my values and my aspirations and my patterns and so on. Mm-hmm. Number two, someone who knew them well had to take that same assessment for them and agree, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't, if we had just asked people to volunteer, hey, are you self-aware? Come be in our study. We all know how that would turn out, right? So self-rated self-awareness, other-rated self-awareness, and then both the person and the person who was rating them had to agree that they had made a dramatic improvement in their level of self-awareness. And when we looked at what these people had in common, we found really only 2 things. Number one was a belief in the supreme importance of seeing themselves clearly at work and in life. And number 2 was an almost daily commitment to improving their level of self-awareness. But that was the only thing that tied them together.
Interesting stuff. And definitely the criteria that you talked through there is so rigorous that it's fascinating what emerges when you go through that level of rigor, I guess. So yeah, then we maybe will talk a bit about the how-to or the tools, as you said, that are very important. And obviously I want people to buy your book and get more detail in that. But what are the things that you think anyone could take on board to develop their self-awareness? Easy habits or practices that they could start using that will show improvements early to give them momentum.
So I'm going to break that down into 2 specific pieces of advice that map on to the 2 types of self-awareness we've identified. So just to kind of break this down and hack the code of self-awareness, we discovered that when people know themselves, there's basically 2 general things they know. And I referred to this earlier, but I'll be more specific now. Number 1 is they have kind of an internal understanding of who they are, self-awareness from the inside out. This is something we called internal self-awareness. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that most well-intentioned people think that if you just go kind of sit on a beach or in a beautiful mountain scenery and, extra credit for being in the lotus position and think about yourself, that you will build that internal self-awareness. But what we've discovered, and again, we could do a 2-hour podcast on this, but just to oversimplify it a little bit, is that thinking about ourselves too deeply and, for example, trying to excavate our unconsciousness is actually not only does it fail to produce results that are true, but it can sort of lead us astray. And so one of the practices that we learned from our participants that I think is really easy and quick every day is, you don't have to spend hours and hours every week in the psychoanalyst chair. What you can do instead is what I've named the daily check-in. And pretty much all of our participants ask themselves these questions in some form or fashion. And I'm talking 5 minutes or less. So this could be, you could ask these questions when you're, when the world starts up again, when you're coming home from work. You could think about them when you're brushing your teeth every night. It's a very flexible process. So here's what the questions are. Mm-hmm. Number 1, what went well today? Number 2, what did not go so well today? And number 3, how can I be smarter tomorrow? And what we've discovered is that having this focused check-in prevents us from getting into all of those introspection traps that I mentioned before. Now, is this some total thing that will get us internally self-aware? Of course not. But I do think it's one of the most tangible, practical, sort of low time invested practices that, if we start doing that and nothing else, you can really get some great improvement. The second piece of self-awareness that we've identified is self-awareness from the outside in. So what this is, we named it external self-awareness. It means understanding how other people see us. And interestingly, internal and external self-awareness are completely independent. So just because you have one doesn't mean that you also have the other. So we have to kind of work on both of them. Okay. And the second tool that I'll give you is going to sound really scary, but I'm actually going to talk about why it's not as scary as it sounds. And it's called the dinner of truth. This is something that I learned from a great communications professor named Josh Meisner. And he's done this with, literally probably now like tens of thousands of his students over the years. Right. And here's what you do. So you basically find someone who is important to you, who you want to even deepen your relationship with, and you take them out to a meal. I suggest dinner because, sometimes adult beverages and moderation can be helpful in this conversation, but it doesn't have to be. And so you sit down at dinner or lunch and you ask them the following question. What do I do that is most annoying to you? And then you listen. And I would never ask my executive coaching clients or my readers to do anything that I myself haven't tried multiple times. Right. And so the first time I actually went through this, I found by design what I thought was my most crotchety friend. And his name is Mike. And so I was thinking, gosh, wow, I'm having a lot of different emotions right now. I have this secret fear that actually when I ask him that question, he's going to say, I'm glad you asked because I never really liked you in the first place. Right. I was expecting him to say, yeah, you suck as a person and I never want to talk to you again. And I think that's a very reasonable human fear. We evolved to be social creatures. And so there's this low level fear that we're going to get voted off the island. But I pushed through it anyway. And I asked him the question and he sort of thought for a minute and he said, well, Tasha, here's my feedback for you. I love you in person, but I hate you on social media.
Wow.
And I thought, wow. So I had several thoughts going through my mind at that point. I said, first of all, he said he loves me. So that's an affirming statement. Second of all, the feedback he gave me is highly actionable, very specific. And again, not an indictment of who I am. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of that was at that point, I had a choice. And this is where I go back to, it is always better to know. So I could have gone on never having asked him that question. And been, I call it the cult of self, been a member of the cult of self on social media, telling everyone how great I was all the time. But now I had a choice. And that feedback actually really fundamentally changed. This was several years ago, how I show up on social media, both in, personally and professionally. And so the reason I like sharing that example is it shows us that our worst fears are almost never confirmed, that what we learn is almost always very actionable. And then probably most important, that it can be an experience that deepens our connections with other people.
Very, very cool. And I think I probably wrote about 5 questions down on the back of that second one. So I might ask one or two just on the dinner of truth. So I presume if I was to go for dinner of truth with somebody I know to learn a little bit more about myself, I would let them know beforehand that we're going for a dinner of truth and I'm going to be asking you to tell me stuff, or you kind of just land it with them and, they probably need a bit of time to think about it.
So this is the part that's more of an art than a science. I do think there are different types of people. So one example, I work with a lot of engineers who are senior leaders. And I would imagine if I was having a dinner of truth with an engineer, I might want to give them a heads up because they're methodical and analytical and they want to think it through. If I was meeting with, I'm just making this up, if I was meeting with a friend who is in sales or, who's like super extroverted and flies by the seat of their pants, it might be okay to sort of ask them in that setting and not give them the heads up. Mm-hmm. What I think is actually even more important than that is playing out in your mind what you think might happen after you ask that question. Because, and Josh Meisner, the professor that came up with this exercise, has learned this over the years as well. And he sort of advises his students that be prepared for someone to just sit there and look at you wide-eyed. Because most of the time, this is part of the reason so few people are self-aware. We don't ask these questions of each other. And in that context, if that happens, you can say something like, listen, I know this question, you might feel like I'm trying to trick you, or you might feel like, you know what you want to say, but you don't know if I really want to hear it. And I want to assure you that I'm just doing this to check my perception. I'm doing this because our relationship is important to me. I want to be the best friend or the best colleague that I can be to you. And so please don't worry about offending me. My job is to listen with an open mind to anything you have to say and to thank you and be grateful for what you provide. So I actually think that's more important than what you do beforehand.
Okay, interesting. And just one other on that, you mentioned the dichotomy, I suppose, of what the feedback was for you on as a person versus on social media. In a way, we have sub-personalities or we're different people in certain different mediums, I suppose. Would that be fair to say? And that is it okay sometimes to be that different person on social media than you are in person, do you think?
Gosh, I would never put a judgment on anyone for what they choose to do, in real life versus social media. I am a big believer in coherence. There's been a lot of research on something called emotional labor, which is basically the toll that trying to seem like we're someone that we're not, and the toll that takes on us in the long term. And I do believe that if we can be, the best version of who we are in all situations, and we have that coherence, not only are we building stronger relationships out of authenticity, but we're happier. Just as a quick anecdote and aside that I think it's really important. Yeah. When I'm coaching a CEO, I'll usually talk to about 30 of the people they work with, and also family members, adult kids, spouses, best friends. And sometimes, the reason I started doing that several years ago was people would say, oh, well, you only talk to my coworkers. I'm not this way at home. And now I can say, well, actually, I talked to your wife. She let me, make her feedback not anonymous. So I can tell you exactly what she said. She said that she also sees this behavior, for good and for bad. It's not just the blind spots we have. And so I think, sometimes we even think we're being different, but maybe we're not as different as we believe.
That's bringing the 360 feedback to the next level, I guess, because a lot of times when we do 360s, it's probably just employees or peers that you go to, but get to the family and kids, really get the dirty linen out for sure.
Exactly. And the funny thing is I almost never learn anything I didn't already know from talking to their board members or their employees, but it just adds such a richness to it, because then not only are they working on their success at work and their happiness at work, but it ripples out into every area of their life. And it's incredible to be a part of and to help with.
And just on that as well, as you're working now more and more with CEOs and self-awareness is becoming more important, are you noticing that their personality or them as a whole doesn't have to be so different in work as it is out of work? Do you see a kind of a movement towards being authentic, in all circumstances, or is it, this is my work life, that's my home life, they're very different?
So I actually think this has been magnified in the last month or so. Leaders who, especially senior leaders, who separate the person they are from the role they play at work are not able to build a level of trust and commitment in the people that follow them. And it's interesting because when times are good, that's fine. It's fine because, everything's good. We're not in crisis. People are probably going to follow me. That's fine. But what I'm seeing right now is a divide between, and I'm proud to work with clients that do this so well, and I'm proud to help them do this so well. But sort of other leaders that maybe are not bringing who they are as a person into their leadership, that's when things start to unravel, right? If you are working for someone, whether it's the CEO or your direct supervisor, who you don't really know who they are, you don't know what to expect, you don't know what's important to them, you don't know about their family and the fact that they're a human, beyond just being your boss. It's a lot harder to feel safe and to be able to soldier on in the midst of a crisis. And so if anything right now, what I am coaching my clients to do is to bring more of that in. I'm working with a leader right now who has a very, very huge job at a technology company that everybody's heard of. And he filmed this video for, his thousands of people that work for him. And I said, I would suggest that you refilm the video and put a couple of family pictures behind you. And at first he was like, why? That's so stupid. I don't want to refilm the video. And then it's like, no, people have to see who you are. They have to be able to connect with you as a human right now. If we have any chance of getting through this, and vice versa, right? Everybody who's a leader should be connecting with their teams on a personal level. We're all video conferencing from home. And so that becomes infinitely easier overnight. And I do see that as, in this terrible situation, I actually see that as an opportunity to build deeper and more human relationships that can help us, get through this crisis.
Interesting. And just the last one on that area, I suppose, developing self-awareness for leaders that maybe weren't that self-aware. There's probably a lot of discomfort in that process. How do they deal with the discomfort or that move to be becoming more self-aware? Anything that you advise or you've seen work well?
So I think a couple of things. Number one, it's really about that moment that you sit down with your client and deliver the results of their 360. And again, since I do interviews, this is, personal stuff. Mm-hmm. And very often they learn things they're doing well that they didn't know before, but probably even more often they learn things that they're not doing as well, that they didn't know. And the first thing is to normalize that reaction. I have seen, pretty much at this point, nothing can surprise me. I have seen people cry, people yell. I had a guy once who punched a wall. I had a woman once who accused me of making up the feedback. Like the feedback was fake news and it couldn't possibly be true. I could go on and on. But what was interesting there is every single one of those people that I just mentioned made incredible, dramatic transformations. And so what I've learned is our initial reaction to sort of learning the truth or the perceptions that others have of us, doesn't predict how successful we'll be. So I think it's okay. It's okay to be upset. What I tell my clients is kind of the second thing is this is a finite pain. The pain of knowing is not always easy. But I say it's like a short fire walk. And then at the end, there are puppies and rainbows. We just have to get you to the other side. And then what I try to do is break it down for people into, what are the very practical, small changes we can help you make on a daily basis to improve in the areas that you've chosen to improve. And 99.9% of the time, that'll get us there.
Brilliant. Yeah. Great imagery there. Puppies and rainbows are always good things to think about.
It's hard not to want those, right? You gotta walk through the coals, but there's something great on the other side.
Totally. When I put it out on LinkedIn that we were going to be talking, I asked folks for a couple of questions. So I got a couple of questions. I might just ask one out of them that I can put to you and see what your take is, if you're okay with that.
Great.
Okay, so this is from a lady called Moira O'Toole, good Irish name. Having done a psychometric test last week, I found myself discussing the results with quite a few people. And one thing that fascinates me is this question. So build up to this question. How can people who are not self-aware but think they are complete any self-assessment or psychometric test accurately?
Moira, I really like you. And I think that is a fair question. That's, let me give you an example. I'm going to answer your question with an example of why I think she is,
she's
onto something.
Yeah.
So there's a very famous book on emotional intelligence out there. And the book claims that, after surveying 500,000 people, that people's level of emotional intelligence has dramatically improved over the last 15 years. There's just one problem. Those are self-reported scores of emotional intelligence. And if you think about the people who are not emotionally intelligent, if you ask them, what percentage of people are you more emotionally intelligent than? They would say, yes, I'm in the 80th percentile. I am more emotionally intelligent than 80% of people. Right. So there are inherent limitations in evaluating our own behaviors and characteristics, particularly when those things are socially desirable. And this has been shown over and over and over again that, especially in areas that, are things that most people want. We want to be funny. We want to be socially savvy. We want to be smart. We want to be great leaders. We're often not the best judges of our own behaviors and traits. Now, does this mean that our viewpoint never matters? Definitely not. There's a lot of research that shows that both are important, right? So our own evaluations of ourselves and other people's evaluations of us. And the art of self-awareness is sometimes living with those paradoxes. The self-aware people that we studied in our research program were able to sort of live with that paradox. They would say, okay, well, this is interesting. I've always seen myself as, someone who's emotionally intelligent, but I, got this feedback that suggests that I might not be. Okay, that's interesting. And so I think the worst thing someone could do as a result of, listening to this podcast is to completely discount their own self-views. But I think by that same token, if we only rely on our self-views, we're going to be missing a very important part of the picture.
Very good answer on the spot. Brilliantly put. Moira would be delighted to hear that. And just one other one, and we'll wrap up then because I'm conscious of time. This one came in from a couple of folks, Francesco and Lorraine, and it kind of touches on the quadrant in Johari's window of the unknown to me and unknown to others. Is there any tool or any approach that you can work on to kind of uncover that or kind of get things to emerge from that unknown quadrant? Anything come up for you there?
That quadrant on the Johari window has always been a bit of a mystery to me. But hearing you ask this question in the unprecedented moment that we all find ourselves in all around the world actually creates a little bit of clarity. I think, so if let's say it's a skill you have that heretofore has been unknown to you and unknown to others. Yeah. If you significantly change the situation you're in or the rules of the situation or your environment, it creates the potential for you to bring out new things in yourself.
Yeah.
And so what I would encourage people to do, again, in the midst of this absolutely terrible situation, is that this might be an opportunity. My friend Alan Mullally, who saved Ford from the brink of bankruptcy,
Wow.
In less than 5 years, he took them from one of the worst years on record to one of the best.
Mm-hmm.
He says, when a crisis happens and you're a leader, it's go time. And so I think, maybe that's a good thing for us to end on today is the immense opportunity, not just for us to learn more about ourselves, through self-reflection and through getting feedback from others in this crisis, but the opportunity to rise to the occasion and to find strengths that we never even knew we had.
Definitely a great way to end. And as you were talking through that, it kind of was rolling around in my own head. And the circumstances we're in right now, myself and my partner have a 15-month-old baby, and I don't think it was both unknown to both of us that we could work from home and look after him at the same time, and keep the balls in the air. So I think I've learned something from that quadrant in the last few weeks as well. Tasha, that was amazing to talk with you. Really delighted to have this time and learn so much from your work. Could you give a call out on how folks can find out more about you, where best to go?
Sure. So what I've learned is it's not about me, it's about them. And so what I always promote when I'm doing a conversation like this is a free quiz that we developed for the launch of Insight a couple of years ago. We didn't intend to leave it up as long as we have, but we've just had this amazing response. So we've continued to make it available. If folks want to get a high level view of their own self-awareness as rated by them and someone who knows them well, it's a quick little 5-minute quiz. And then if you send it to someone else who knows you, and once the system has all of those results, it'll send you a report on kind of your high level self-awareness and then a couple of specific things you can do to improve it, should you so choose. If anybody's interested in that, you can go to insight-quiz.com.
Very cool. I think I did that
and
myself.
then I'm very findable throughout those channels if anyone cares. But I care most about you guys and your self-awareness and giving you the tools you need.
Brilliant. And you're working on another book right now as well. I saw you putting some posts out about the research for that. Can you share anything about that?
I can. I'm laughing a little bit because it's amazing how the universe has doubled down on how important it is for me to write this book in the last couple of weeks. So the working title is When Bad Things Happen.
Could be the bestseller of all time, I think.
I know, right? And like this has been several months that I've been working on this book. And originally, the focus was on kind of the surviving and rising up from the interpersonal injuries that we experience at work. So if we're harmed or hurt or betrayed, how do we kind of get through that and become even better for it? But one of the things I'm sort of toying with right now is does the definition of bad things need to expand, right? Mm-hmm. To, some of the situations we find ourselves in now. So, writing books is always a fun process because there's a lot of surprises along the way, but I've learned to trust the process, and we'll see where it ends up.
Very cool. Definitely trust the process. It seems to work so far. Tasha, thanks so much for taking the time out today again. I really do look forward to sharing this out with listeners.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Great stuff. Thanks so much. Hey folks, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, could you please consider helping me extend the reach of the podcast that a little bit further? You can do that in a number of ways. The number one way is to subscribe on your app of choice. This helps me with the chart ranking, leading to more folks stumbling across the podcast and checking it out. You could also repost it on your social media channels. Any of them would be great. And maybe even tell a friend in person or over the phone. Pick up the phone, give them a call and tell them about the 1% Better podcast. Tell them about this episode or one that you've heard in the past. Any will do. I would really appreciate it. In the last year, we set up a 1% Better Slack community, which you can join for free and interact with me and other members of the community and improve through holding each other accountable and sharing monthly challenges. It's a lot of fun. Check it out. I'm into season 4 of this incredible journey, and the more of these interviews and solo shows that I research, record and share, the better I believe that they get, and more loaded with actionable takeaways that you can learn from. I know I've learned so much from it so far, and it's always really, really fulfilling and rewarding when I hear from you on what you took from it. So do reach out, rob@robofthegreen.ie. And of everybody that listens, 90% listen and enjoy, but only around 10% actually take action, write down takeaways and put them into practice. I am convinced that if we can move that number a bit higher, the listeners will not only make steps forward towards their goals, but they will be more fulfilled and happy and better. Change doesn't happen overnight. It is hard, but it's all about taking the first step, whatever that is for you. You can absolutely do this. Make a plan, be deliberate, take action. Don't overreach. Start with those small incremental improvements, and over time you will see great progress. It's all in the pursuit of betterness. So again, thank you so much for listening. Good luck and stay safe.